You're listening to the Okanagan Reader, where we present readings of short stories and other works that have been released under a Creative Commons license by their creators. In keeping with the license, these recordings are released under a matching license. You are free to listen to and share these readings as set out in their version of the Creative Commons license. Today's reading is Water Off a Black Dog's Back, Part 1, a short story in the collection Stranger Things Happen by Kelly Link. And now, Water Off a Black Dog's Back by Kelly Link. Tell me which you could sooner do without, love or water. What do you mean? I mean, could you live without love, or could you live without water? Why can't I have both? Rachel Rook took Carol home to meet her parents 2 months after she first slept with him. For a generous girl, a girl who took off her clothes with abandon, she was remarkably closed-mouthed about some things. In 2 months, Carol had learned that her parents lived on a farm several miles outside town, that they sold strawberries in summer and Christmas trees in the winter. He knew that they never left the farm. Instead, the world came to them in the shape of weekend picnickers and drive-by tourists. "Do you think your parents will like me?" he said. He had spent the afternoon preparing for this visit as carefully as if he were preparing for an exam. He had gotten his hair cut, trimmed his nails, washed his neck and behind his ears. The outfit he had chosen, khaki pants and a blue button-down shirt, no tie, lay neatly folded on the bed. He stood before Rachel in his plain white underwear and white socks, gazing at her as if she were a mirror. "No," she said. It was the first time she had been to his apartment, and she stood square in the center of his bedroom, her arms folded against her body as if she was afraid to sit down, to touch something. "Why?" "My father will like you," she said, "but he likes everyone. My mother's more particular. She thinks that you lack a serious nature." Carol put on his pants, admiring the crease. "So you've talked to her about me?" "Yes, but you haven't talked about her to me." "No." "Are you ashamed of her?" Rachel snorted. Then she sighed in a way that seemed to suggest she was regretting her decision to take him home. "You're ashamed of me," he guessed, and Rachel kissed him and smiled and didn't say anything. Rachel still lived on her parents' farm, which made it all the more remarkable that she had kept Carol and her parents apart for so long. It suggested a talent for daily organization that filled Carol's heart with admiration and lust. She was 19, 2 years younger than Carol. She was a student at Jellicoe College, and every weekday she rose at 7 and biked 4 miles into town, and then back again on her bike 4 miles uphill to the farm. Carol met Rachel at the Jellicoe College library, where he had a part-time job. He sat at the checkout desk, stamping books and reading Tristram Shandy for a graduate class. He was almost asleep when someone said, "Excuse me." He looked up. The girl who stood before the tall desk was red-headed. Sunlight, streaming in through a high window opposite her, lit up the fine hairs on her arm, the embroidered flowers on the collar of her white shirt. The sunlight turned her hair to fire, and Carol found it difficult to look directly at her. "Can I help you?" he said. She placed a shredded rectangle on the desk, and Carol picked it up between his thumb and forefinger. Pages hung in tatters from the sodden blue spine. Title, binding, and covers had been gnawed away. "I need to pay for a damaged book," she said. "What happened? Did your dog eat it?" he said, making a joke. "Yes," she said, and smiled. "What's your name?" Carol said. Already he thought he might be in love. The farmhouse where Rachel lived had a wrap-around porch like an apron. It had been built on a hill and looked down a long green slope of Christmas trees toward the town and Jellicoe College. It looked old-fashioned and a little forlorn. On one side of the house was a small barn, and behind the barn was an oval pond, dark and fringed with pine trees. It winked in the twilight like a glossy, lidless eye. The sun was rolling down the grassy rim of the hill towards the pond, and the exaggerated shadows of Christmas trees, long and pointed as witches' hats, stitched black triangles across the purple-gray lawn. House, barn, and hill were luminous in the fleet purple light. Carol parked the car in front of the barn and went around to Rachel's side to hand her out. A muffled, ferocious breathing emanated from the barn, and the doors shuddered as if something inside was hurling itself repeatedly towards them, through the dark and airless space. There was a sour animal smell. "What's in there?" Carol asked. "The dogs," Rachel said. "They aren't allowed in the house, and they don't like to be separated from my mother." "I like dogs," Carol said. There was a man sitting on the porch. He stood up as they approached the house and came forward to meet them. He was of medium build and had pink-brown hair like his daughter. Rachel said, "Daddy, this is Carol Murtaugh. Carol, this is my daddy." Mr. Rook had no nose. He shook hands with Carol. His hand was warm and dry, flesh and blood. Carol tried not to stare at Mr. Rook's face. In actual fact, Rachel's father did have a nose, which was carved out of what appeared to be pine. The nostrils of the nose were flared slightly, as if Mr. Rook were smelling something pleasant. Copper wire ran through the bridge of the nose, attaching it to the frame of a pair of glasses. It nestled, delicate as a sleeping mouse, between the two lenses. "Nice to meet you, Carol," he said. "I understand that you're a librarian down at the college. You like books, do you?" His voice was deep and sonorous, as if he were speaking out of a well. Carol was later to discover that Mr. Rook's voice changed slightly, depending on which nose he wore. "Yes, sir," Carol said. Just to be sure, he looked back at Rachel. As he had thought, her nose was unmistakably the genuine article. He shot her a second accusatory glance. "Why didn't you tell me?" She shrugged. Mr. Rook said, "I don't have anything against books myself, but my wife can't stand 'em. Nearly broke her heart when Rachel decided to go to college." Rachel stuck out her lower lip. "Why don't you give your mother a hand, Rachel, setting the table, while Carol and I get to know each other?" "All right," Rachel said, and went into the house. Mr. Rook sat down on the porch steps, and Carol sat down with him. "She's a beautiful girl," Mr. Rook said, "just like her mother." "Yes, sir," Carol said. "Beautiful." He stared straight ahead and spoke forcefully, as if he had not noticed that he was talking to a man with a wooden nose. "You probably think it's odd, don't you, a girl her age still living at home?" Carol shrugged. "She seems attached to both of you. You grow Christmas trees, sir?" "Strawberries, too," Mr. Rook said. "It's a funny thing about strawberries and pine trees. People will pay you to let them dig up their own. They do all the work, and then they pay you for it. They say the strawberries taste better that way, and they may be right. Myself, I can't taste much anyway." Carol leaned back against the porch rail and listened to Mr. Rook speak. He sneaked sideways looks at Mr. Rook's profile. From a few feet away, in the dim cast of the porch light, the nose had a homely, thoughtful bump to it. It was a philosopher's nose, a questing nose. White moths, large as Carol's hand, pinwheeled around the porch light. They threw out tiny halos of dark and stirred up breaths of air with their wings, coming to rest on the porch screen, folding themselves into stillness like fans. Moths have no noses either, Carol thought. I can't smell the pine trees either, Mr. Rook said. I have to appreciate the irony in that. You'll have to forgive my wife if she seems a bit awkward at first. She's not used to strangers. Rachel danced out onto the porch. Dinner's almost ready, she said. Has Daddy been keeping you entertained? He's been telling me all about your farm, Carol said. Rachel and her father looked at each other thoughtfully. That's great, Rachel said. You know what he's really dying to ask, Daddy. Tell him about your collection of noses. Oh, no, Carol protested. I wasn't wondering at all. But Mr. Rook stood up, dusting off the seat of his pants. I'll go get them down. I almost wore a fancier one tonight, but it's so windy tonight and rather damp. I didn't trust it not to rain. He hurried off into the house. Carol leaned over to Rachel. Why didn't you tell me? He said, looking up at her from the porch rail. What? That your father has a wooden nose. He has several noses, but you heard him. It might rain. Some of them, she said, are liable to rust. Why does he have a wooden nose? Carol said. He was whispering. A boy named Beiderbecke bit it off in a fight. The alliteration evidently pleased her because she said a little louder, Beiderbecke bit it off when you were a boy. Isn't that right, Daddy? The porch door swung open again, and Mr. Rook said, Yes, but I don't blame him, really. I don't. We were little boys, and I called him a stinking kraut. That was during the war, and afterwards he was very sorry. You have to look on the bright side of things. Your mother would never have noticed me if it hadn't been for my nose. That was a fine nose. I modeled it on Abraham Lincoln's nose and carved it out of black walnut. He set a dented black tackle box down next to Carol, squatting beside it. Look here. The inside of the tackle box was lined with red velvet, and the mild light of the October moon illuminated the noses, glowing as if a jeweler's lamp had been turned upon them. Noses made of wood and beaten copper, tin and brass. One seemed to be silver, veined with beads of turquoise. There were aquiline noses, noses pointed like Gothic spires, noses with nostrils curled up like tiny bird claws. Who made these? Carol said. Mr. Rook coughed modestly. It's my hobby, he said. Pick one up if you like. Go ahead, Rachel said to Carol. Carol chose a nose that had been painted over with blue and pink flowers. It was glassy smooth and light in his hand, like a blown eggshell. It's beautiful, he said. What's it made out of? Papier-mâché. There's one for every day of the week, Mr. Rook said. What did the original look like? Carol asked. Hard to remember, really. It wasn't much of a nose, Mr. Rook said. Before.